Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 22 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on a bare, unloved room in a young offenders institution. It is a classroom of sorts, with a whiteboard, a table, and a few chairs. Two young men in green tracksuits, Kane, 16, and Jonjo, 17, are waiting for others to arrive, or something to begin. Kane is a wiry bundle of energy, talking non-stop. Jonjo sits without responding, while Kane bounces around him. A third young man enters, Riyadh, also 16. He is tense, coiled like a spring. Kane is wary of him. With this setup, we are expecting aggression, conflict, even violence. But the next arrival is Grace, the 31-year-old leader of what is to be a class for these lads. Not a class in carpentry or bricklaying, however, but in parenting skills, learning how to look after a baby. Because all three of these underage offenders are, or about to be, fathers. This is the premise of Samuel Bailey's exceptional play Shook, which premiered at the Southwark Playhouse in London in late 2019 before a short UK tour. It was scheduled to transfer to the Trafalgar Theatre in the West End in the spring of 2020 when coronavirus closed our theatres. I was disappointed because I had bought tickets for the transfer based on the advice of my friend, drama publisher Nick Hearn, who had recommended the play as his personal choice on the podcast back in episode 2, and whose judgment I've always trusted. Fortunately, Papatango, the original producers of Shook, filmed their production of the play and released it to view online in February 2021, when I was lucky enough to see it. If you're listening to this in March 2021, before you think, oh no, that's a shame, I just missed it seeing it online, I'm pleased to say that you can still catch it because the online run has been extended until the 28th of March. You can find it on Papatango's website, or there's also a link on our website. Watching Shook, I can honestly say that I've rarely been so affected by a theatrical experience. The play is sharp and funny and enlightening and very, very moving, and the performances in Papatango's production are also wonderful. What is more remarkable is that Shook is Samuel Bailey's full-length debut as a playwright. As you know, the raison d'etre of the Play Podcast is to explore the greatest new and classic plays, and so far we've covered a mix of some recent plays with a number of classics. Given that the theatres have been closed for most of the past year, we may have selected more classics, so I'm really excited today to be able to pick this very new play by a very new writer. And I'm extra delighted to be able to talk to the writer himself, Sam Bailey, and to George Turvey, the artistic director of Papatango, who brought the show to life. Welcome, Sam and George. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
If I may, I'd like to give listeners a bit of a more proper introduction to you both, briefly. Samuel Bailey was born in London and raised in the West Midlands. He began writing plays in Bristol and developed work with the Bristol Old Vic, Tobacco Factory Theatres, and Theatre West before moving back to London. He is an alumnus of the Old Vic 12 program and of the Orange Tree Writers Collective. His play Shook won the 2019 Papatango Award. I believe that he currently has a new play in progress for Payne's Plough and Theatre Royal Plymouth, as well as a film script for Peter Cattaneo, the director of The Full Monty. George Turvey trained as an actor and has appeared on stage and screen in roles as diverse as the world premiere of Arthur Miller's No Villain at the Old Red Lion Theatre and Trafalgar Studios, and in the Batman Live World Arena Tour. George co-founded Papatango in 2007 and became the sole artistic director in January 2013. As their dramaturg, he has led the development of all of Papatango's productions, which have been produced in London Fringe Theatres, on UK tours, and on radio. He is also the co-author of Being a Playwright, a career guide for writers, published by Nick Hearn Books. So that is the formal bit over, guys. First question, George. I've mentioned Papatango and the fact that Shook won the 2019 Papatango New Writing Prize. before we dive into the play itself, I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about what Papatango do, because I think you're doing some great work.
Yeah, thank you very much. Papatango are a new writing theatre company and charity, and I suppose we exist to open up pathways to emerging playwrights into the industry and to give them a launch pad to hopefully go on and have a career as a playwright. And in doing that, we work on several different streams. One is obviously the New Writing Prize, which you just spoke a little bit about, which has been running, I think, for 12 years now. And that's free to enter, it's open to anybody. It's assessed anonymously, and the aim is that we pick one play and then we will produce that play for a full run in London, take it on tour, and give that playwright what all emerging playwrights need, I think, which is that production. We also do a lot of participation engagement work, which is under the umbrella of Go Write, which is doing playwriting workshops in state schools, secondary state schools, in which we teach playwriting over a session, then go back in. The students write plays in groups. We publish their plays in a play text. We go back in with actors and perform their plays. We do playwriting courses in regional venues, and we also do one-off playwriting workshops as well. So it's about giving people the tools to then hopefully write a play, enter it into the prize, win the prize, and go on and have great success.
That's fantastic. Well, we'll talk to Sam in a second about that experience of winning the prize. But the work you're doing in schools, I was looking at what you were doing online, and it's just fantastic because in this age where drama in schools seems to be under threat, and it's so essential for kids to get some exposure. I read somewhere that they were talking about eliminating actual live visits to theaters and just getting them to watch digital theater for kids. And I was thinking, right. Oh my God, they're missing the point.
Exactly.
So it's great work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you.
And the prize itself, I also read that there were like 1,500 entries.
There were.
I don't know who's reading them all, but Sam, that's an amazing to win that. I was going to ask George, what was it initially about Sam's play that made it the prize winner, that it jumped out for you and made you want to actually direct it?
A lot of what you've just said in your introduction, what leaps straight off the page are these characters. The characters are incredible. They're so detailed. They're so unique and individual and believable. And the dialogue flows at such an incredible pace. And it's also one of those rare things as a play that, especially now, I think, in the way that playwriting is going more and more, in that it creeps up on you. It almost pretends to be one play for 10, 15 pages, and then it completely sideswipes you as something completely different. And the way that Sam sort of plays with his audience and manipulates his audience in many ways by making you laugh and then hitting you with something incredibly tragic, and also, but doing it in such subtle ways. That some of these characters talk about things that have happened in their life, and it's such a throwaway comment. And I think the more you watch, I've seen this play, I don't know how many times now, and I still find new things every single viewing and every time I read the play. And it's so rare to read a play that has all of that, especially from an emerging playwright and not somebody who's had a very, very successful career already.
Yes, you're spot on, and we'll talk more obviously in detail about these qualities, the characters. The fluency of it is fantastic, and as you say, the subtlety, because it just knocks you for six at various times, but it's doing it effortlessly. I'd love to hear, Sam, about your journey to winning this prize and seeing your play produced with such success. Where did playwriting start for you, and what were the steps along the way to Shook?
Playwriting started for me at the Bristol Old Vic. I moved to Bristol when I was about 20, after, as you said in your very kind introduction, growing up in the Midlands really, and not really having a huge amount of access to theatre or culture. I remember getting taken to theatre once when I was in maybe year 9 or something, and sort of sneaking out at the interval. And when I was 20, I sort of called my dad up and my stepmom, and I said, can I come and stay in your spare room, because I need a change really. So I came to live in Bristol, and my stepmom was an actor when I was small. So actually it's my first experience of the theatre, as my dad likes to tell it, is that they took me to see something that she was in when I was about 6 or 7. And she had to kiss another man as part of the role. And I cried because I didn't understand what was going on, and they had to take me out. And they didn't take me back to the theatre again in any great rush after that, because I think I'd expressed my distaste for it. But anyway, so when I moved down to Bristol, didn't really know anyone here. And I think I was just getting under everyone's feet, really. So my dad and my stepmom were basically like, just get out of the house, go away. You're really annoying. There's a theatre down the road. You should go and do something there. And you might meet some people, you might make some friends. And I was very resistant for about 6 months because I associate it with having to do some acting and then they said, oh, there's a writing program that you can do. And I'd done a media studies A-level. So I think as part of one of the modules for that, you like write a short film or something like that. And I'd quite enjoyed it. So it was through my stepmom really and her involvement in the industry. She'd stopped acting by this point, but was obviously still aware that the Old Vic existed. So yeah, she sent me down there and I just sort of hung around for about 2 years just because I enjoyed the community of it. I met some really amazing people and I was very overawed by them initially that I didn't write anything for about 2 years. And eventually people started going, when I was in the bar, sort of hanging around with my new friends, people going, what do you actually do here? And I was always like, oh, well, I'm a writer. I'm doing the writers program or whatever. And then eventually I realised that I'd have to actually try writing a play. Otherwise I'd just be a complete fraud. So I tried writing a play and it came out all right. And that made me think, well, maybe I'll try my hand at it. Up to the point of Shook, I'd always had to work full time and write around that. So the last year has been the first time where I've normally been a professional writer, but I've been writing for about 6 years.
I love the fact that it's there's something fateful about this, that you were just pushed down the road to the theatre in Bristol and all follows from that. But somewhere in you, you find a place you feel like you want to be. But then also that question about, am I allowed to be here? Am I really a writer? I mean, some of that's echoed in the play, which we'll talk about whether these boys feel like they are entitled to go and do anything particularly in the world.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in particularly now about where Shook came from. Was this based on any personal experience? Because there's an acknowledgement in the published text, which I was really intrigued by, where you said the lads back home who think theatre is rubbish, but are in some form in every play I've written. So are there lads back home that inspired Shook?
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up with 2 or 3 boys in my local area and estate that I grew up in who spent time in young offenders institutions and latterly in their lives prison. So yeah, it was a place I was always aware of. It was a place that I've never been myself, and hopefully will never end up in a place like that. I don't think it's likely. I wouldn't survive for a second, to be honest. But it was always somewhere that I heard stories of, and they'd go in for 6 months and come back and talk about, what had happened there. And so it was sort of informed by that, really. The research of it wasn't necessarily, I'll go to Feltham YOY or whatever and talk to some people. It's just something that sort of by osmosis I'd imbibed over the years of hanging out with these young men, really. And the characters, each one isn't a specific person. They're sort of an amalgamation of 2 or 3 different people. And Kane is the energy of one guy I grew up with the story of another guy. When I had a couple of friends come to see it, none of them could completely identify exactly who was who, but they could see the influences from each person and go, oh, you nicked that from so-and-so. And so, yeah, it's not personal experience, but sort of one step removed, I suppose.
Well, it's interesting because the setting, of course, is incredibly convincing. At least I've never been in one, so I was convinced. I wonder, George, we try and give a little synopsis of what the play is about to listeners who haven't seen it yet. Now, I'm a bit torn here because I'm encouraging people to go and watch it right now if they can. And I'm never entirely sure what to do about the spoilers in this case, but I think we may end up spoiling some things. So be it. The art stands for itself, so you'll still love it if you go and see it afterwards. But maybe you could just introduce who these characters are and what the scenario is going on. I did it very briefly at the beginning.
Yeah, so it's about three young lads. I think they're 16 and 17, who are in a young offenders institution, and they are also either already fathers or soon to be fathers. So two of them already have children, and one of them, his girlfriend, is pregnant, so he will soon be a father. And over the course of the play, they are having lessons on parenting skills from a new teacher called Grace who comes in. And then it's very much about their sort of journey through that and how they grow as individuals, or how they start to look at their lives and their own upbringings. Things happen, but that's the kind of premise of the play, I suppose.
Yes, it's a combination of, as you said at the beginning, of learning very subtly through the dialogue about, where they've been, where they've come from, what their lives on the outside world consist of, and what it's like to be inside, and what their hopes and prospects for the future are.
Yeah.
And I thought the setting's interesting because it's all set within the walls of this one room. We never leave the room. So everything we're learning about, even in the institution or the outside world, is secondhand. So we're attuned to listening to the dialogue because we want to know what's going on outside those walls, don't we?
Yeah.
Inevitably. The interesting thing I also thought was that their ages, Sam, they're in between, aren't they? Being men, but are still in a lot of ways really boys.
Absolutely.
Was that something you were aware of or knew from your own experience from your past with your mates?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a conscious decision to make them that, because in an earlier draft they were adult prisoners. So the original conception of the play was about dads who were locked up away from their children, but for one reason and another, I got a couple of drafts into that version of Shook and felt that it needed a change, really, and that it wasn't working, and that actually to make them young offenders rather than men in their sort of early 20s was just to make it a more hopeful play in some ways, and to enter into these characters' lives at a point of potential change. And I think sometimes when you're writing a play and it's not working, and you can't quite figure out why, it can sometimes be a really small shift to the left or to the right that can unlock it for you. And for Shook, there were two choices in that. One of them was that I made the age of the characters, I changed that, which I think just made the impact of Grace and what they were doing feel more important, and makes you invest in them more, and makes you feel like that hopefully they can change. And then the other one was that originally the action all took place with Grace in the room, and she was there the whole time and was all within the class setting. And that felt quite dramatically inert, because it didn't give us an opportunity to see these boys with their different sort of masks on and sort of see the hierarchy of the prison, because they were always measured in their responses to each other, understandably, because there was an authority figure in the room. So that was another change that, once I had that idea, just unlocked it, really.
It's brilliant because they're obviously less guarded when Grace is not in the room, and the idea of that age we'll talk more about in terms of the themes of parenting and the generations, but it means that you're sort of looking back and forward as well, because these are still emerging people. They're still not fully formed, clearly, but they betray all these signs of childish, don't they? They trade sweets, and they talk about their Xbox and all this. I mean, the other thing is that I think they're less guarded, aren't they? Somehow you see more inside what these characters really are than men would be.
For sure.
You would barely ever see the mask drop, I think.
I mean, where the sort of choice came from was I was having a conversation with one of my mates who'd been to both young offenders and prison. And he expressed an opinion of those places that quite surprised me, which was that I always thought adult prison would be the more scary place to go to. More serious criminals, blah, blah, blah. He was like, no way, not at all, mate. Young offenders was way more scary, because all these teenagers are trying to prove themselves. They're way more aggressive. The hormones are raging. It's a much more sort of leery place to be, and much more unpredictable, and a lot more fights breaking out and stuff like that. And he was like, adult prison, as his experience was it was a serious place to be, but generally people were in there to do their time. They wanted to get out back to their families. They'd probably done 2 or 3 other sentences before that, and so they understood the nature of what it was and they just wanted to get it over with. Whereas young offenders is a much more sort of febrile atmosphere, I think. And that obviously to me as, you know, a dramatist was like, oh, that sounds more interesting as a place to examine the sort of cyclical nature of these boys' lives.
Well, it's really adds a poignancy because there's the vulnerability of their being so young, but also there's a real sense of the potential danger and the constant threat outside the door of this classroom, isn't there, George? You feel that all the way through, don't you? That there's aggression is happening out there and that they're having to man up to survive.
Exactly, yeah, and I think that's what the classroom offers that's so nice about it, especially as the play grows, is it is a bit of a safe haven for them, which allows them to bond in a way that I don't think they would bond outside. I mean, they definitely haven't. You know, Riyadh and Kane know each other before this class starts, and there's no sense of any connection between them because I think you are very heightened in your sort of paranoia and fear of getting through the day. Whereas in that room, for whatever reason, it gives them that space to feel like they can connect more and build the sort of relationships that they do. And I think that's what's so lovely about the room itself. And then, as Sam was just saying, you know, what's so interesting in the play for me is finding those different ways that they interact with each other when in front of Grace, when all 3 of them are in the room, when there's only 2 of them in the room, when it's just Grace and one of them, you know, the different sort of ways that it makes them react to each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to talk about because there's a very strong sense you mentioned about the hierarchy as well, so that they all have associations outside that they're in grouped with or protected by or whatever, and this somehow reconfigures it for them. They're able to have a different configuration when they come into the classroom.
Yeah.
I wanted to, actually, I should issue a little warning here. I may have broken already, but before we dive further into the play, I should probably issue a warning about that this episode may contain strong language. Or as I noticed, we've been watching a lot of TV recently. I have these warnings come up before TV series. We're watching The Wire, going back to the beginning of The Wire. Brilliant. And the warning before that is there will be strong and frequent language. And I can assure listeners that there will frequently be language in this podcast. Which brings me to the language, actually, Sam, because it's just fantastically sharp. And there's a lot of tough talking, but it's incredible fluency, but also some vernacular or slang. Where did that language come from? And did you make it up, or is this stuff that you know or used yourself?
Oh no, it's all real. I don't think I'd get away with making it all up, to be honest. So yeah, I mean, obviously the boys are from very different places. Riyadh's from, you know, London and that sort of gang culture, and Kane is from Liverpool, which originally Kane was from Oxfordshire, so he's from an estate in Oxfordshire. And Josh, who plays Kane, came in to do the R&D of the play, and I think me and George were just like, oh, wouldn't it be interesting? And he's from the Wirral, so he's from just outside Liverpool. And as soon as we got him to do it in his own voice, we were like, this is more interesting, and it feels a bit more like a play about men in general rather than a play about men from southeast England. I mean, generally they were all from that area because logistically it would be unusual for a lad from Liverpool to be in a nominally London-based young offenders. So we did a bit of sort of logistical fudging there. But that's fine. I think you're allowed a little bit of artistic leeway. Yeah, exactly. So Josh, I'd been to Liverpool once, I think, before. And I mean, none of the characters are from where I grew up, so I didn't make it easy for myself, really. I could have set it around there, but I didn't. So Josh was very, very helpful. So the rhythm and the pattern of his speech obviously had to change because, you know, as someone speaks when they're from a council estate in Oxfordshire to how they speak when they're from Liverpool is very different. And not only the slang they use, but the way that they speak. So Josh was just very helpful, and I just keep asking him questions like, what do you call the police? You know, we call them feds or like 50 where I'm from. He's like, oh, busies. And I'm like, what's a busy? Like, I've never heard that in my entire life. And again, Riyadh, I was born in London and my family from here, so I'm sort of aware of that sort of dialect or whatever you want to call it. But again, I checked that through with a friend of mine who's from Gypsy Hill, and just made sure that all felt authentic, really. And then the prison stuff, again, just went through some friends, who just ratified all that for me and just made sure that everything felt like it was true, basically. Like, one of the things that I put into the play originally was that when Kane offers to go and get them a drink at the end, he offers to go and get them a can because, they're just so ubiquitous in everyday life. And one of my friends who'd been to young offenders was like, nah, they would never have cans because obviously it's metal. So they would just turn it into a weapon if they could. It's all plastic cartons and, sort of like Ribena cartons and stuff like that, which obviously, if you've never been, is a detail that could very easily pass you by. So yeah, all the slang, all the dialogue is true. And well, to the best of my knowledge, obviously, I've not been there, but I'd like to think I've got a decent ear for hearing the way different people speak. And
no, it's one of the joys of the play. The fluency of the language is just breathtaking, and actually Josh's performance and the speed with which he delivers this stuff is fantastic. And of course, one of the things that I also appreciate is that you have all this tough talk, which is the sort of currency of
the bravado.
Yeah, the currency of their environment, but you also end up understanding that there's a vulnerability under there, and they betray signs of their fear or lack of confidence. And that's one of the things that's great about the play, as you said at the beginning, George, I think, is the way you gradually learn more about who these characters are. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the characters themselves in a bit more detail. I wonder, George, if you could tell us a bit more what you think Kane is about. Who is Kane? Where does he come from? And
yeah, so I mean, he's Kane's from Liverpool, and I suppose as a character, he's such a bundle of energy. I mean, once he gets going, he's 100 words a second.
I think he probably has about 50% of the dialogue, doesn't
he? He does, yeah. And I think what's really interesting, certainly in the rehearsals for Shook, that we find is you never know how much of what he says is a lie and what is the truth. And I think that was a real thing that we explored a lot. And I know that quite often when as an actor, when you're rehearsing plays, there's a sort of general rule that if a character says something, it must be the truth. And very much with Kane, I think we looked at the potential that every single thing he says is a lie. So because he's just because he says it doesn't mean it's true.
Or an exaggeration at the very least.
Or an exaggeration of it, yeah, exactly. And I think that was quite a fun thing to play with the audience in that way, that you could keep saying things, and whether they believed it or not, it was up to them. And that as long as Josh knew what he felt was the truth, was the important thing. And I mean, he's just he's such a funny character. He has some incredible lines. But yeah, I mean, like energy, I suppose, is the main thing of him.
Yeah, gosh, he talks a mile a minute. So he's a swaggering character, lots of tough talking, lots of talk about fighting. And I mean, classic, he says, I can do 100 push-ups. I mean, immediately he can't do the 100 push-ups.
No, exactly.
Or did he score 40 goals when he was a footballer? But he might have done. So I think you're absolutely spot on there about not knowing.
I don't think anyone wanted to play football with him, to be honest.
We learn that he's been in this place for a while, or been in and out of these institutions several times. He says he feels at home here. He clearly knows the ways of the place. He's sort of advising John Joe all the time about how to survive. In fact, we discover gradually some facts about what happened to him, where he came from, or at least we believe when he says he was first put in detention at age 12 for mugging an old lady for her handbag, that he beat up a news agent, which is why he's in now. And you have a sense also that this manic energy, he's being expelled from every school in the country because he was unteachable. And I think he refers to ADHD. I mean, Sam, was that conscious? Did you think, yes, Kane has ADHD?
Maybe sort of undiagnosed, potentially, yeah. I mean, Kane is a pure example of somebody who's become institutionalized, really. He's grown up in care. So he's aware of how these situations work. He's quite savvy in that respect. And it's actually on the outside, where he has very little support network or family to take care of him, that he feels lost. This is where he understands the rules of the game, and therefore, consciously or subconsciously, probably does everything he can in his power to come back when he does find himself on the outside, because if you haven't got people at that age looking out for you and protecting you and loving you, nurturing you, then it's a very scary world to be in, I think, really. So I think he's just, all that bravado and all that energy and all that big talk is just, it's just his armor, isn't it, really, you know?
Yes. I mean, you've raised the point I was going to make, which is really, really spot on. Because he comes in at one stage and tells about how one of the prisoners had tried to kill themselves by slicing their wrists. And the other prisoner, he reveals, was slicing his wrist because he didn't want to leave the prison. He was looking at the prospect of being let out, and he didn't want to. And Kane sort of reveals, at some stage we learn that he's been offered an opportunity of what's called restorative justice, where he meets the victim of his crime, and that this might lessen his sentence and may lead to his being able to get out. But in the same way, he has this kind of reaction about whether actually do I want to get out. And I was going to ask you to read, George, this speech of his where he talks about this, if you could.
Yeah.
And it's a very short speech where I think he tells us something honest. Talk about whether, he's telling the truth or not. This sounds like the truth, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, yeah.
Riyadh says to him, one way or another, you're out of here.
Fucking go on then. Get out of here, yeah? What, go back home? What fucking home? I ain't got one. I don't know what that word means. This place here is like fucking Butlins to me. It's like an holiday compared to where I come from. You think I want to go back there? To that fucking shithole? I ain't got no family. I ain't got nowhere to live. No money. What am I leaving for? This is it. Happy, yeah? Now I've said it, you fucking prick. Get the fuck off me.
Brilliant. Thank you.
That was decent, you know. It's not a bad accent.
Thank you.
Way better than I could do. Thank you for reading it.
Yeah, way better than I could do as well.
I found that incredibly moving when that speech comes, because you're thinking, why wouldn't you go for this? Why wouldn't you go for this? And then the reality hits home.
I think it's one of the first really true things that you hear come out of his mouth by that point as well.
Yeah.
Personally, for me, I don't think there's any question of what he's saying is actually true there.
Yeah. Well, because I think it's that it's like a snake caught in the corner, isn't it? Like he's got no choice there. He can't. There's no way out but to say the truth at that point. Is the difference. Whereas the rest of the time, when he can kind of throw off a lie and divert a situation or go off on a tangent.
Yeah, because they're pressing him for the reason that he isn't going to take this up, and so he just has to come clean. And it's so heartbreaking because it's this lack of confidence or any practical experience, I guess, to be able to survive outside the institution. He hasn't had enough experience doing it. And there's, as you said, Sam, there's no support system out there for him. There's nobody out there for him. So John Joe, by contrast, you talk about Kane having 50% of the lines. John Joe must have about 2% of the lines. But he's still a very powerful character in his own right. And when he does speak, it's, it's meaningful. So I wonder, George, what do we learn about his life outside the prison, or about him particularly?
I mean, he's such an interesting character, John Joe, not just for the fact that he doesn't say much, but as you say, when he does say it, there's so much in there and so much that has happened to him, and that he's had an incredibly tough life with his mum and with his stepdad, and that he's been moved around a lot, and that he is a very kind of insular person anyway. I think before he comes into the prison, he'd be very much like that. I think he'd swallow everything. And I think the other interesting thing about John Joe is that because obviously he is going to be in this prison for a long, long time. And I think if there was another play in which we saw John Joe in 5 years' time, he would be a very different person than he is now, because he'd have no choice but to be that. And so that's kind of the great tragedy, I think, of him as a character, is that there's so much in there that you want to help him, but you know that the system is going to destroy him.
Yeah, well, we'll come to that's further on in terms of thinking about what their prospects are and what the future holds for them. There's another passage, Sam, if you could read us from John Joe, which at the end of the second scene, the reason I'm teeing this up is that you spend the first two scenes with John Joe barely saying a word, and we learn so little about him, and the others are pressing him to try and discover, where he come from, why he's there, who he is, what even his name is. And so little is coming out of him, but finally, at the end of the second scene, he has this uncharacteristically long speech where he tells us something about where he comes from. Do you mind, Sam? I don't think any particular accent. What accent did we think John Joe had?
Let's give it a go. I mean, he talks about being from Bromley, so it's sort of South London, isn't it? So, yeah, I'm just going to do it in my own.
You go for it. You wrote it. You're entitled to do it however you want.
I do whatever I want to do. All right. I used to walk my dog down to Hay Street Farm and cut across the common to Norman Park. Sometimes I'd walk her for hours. I'd throw her a stick and people would pet her, and behind the cricket club was some water she'd swim in if she got hot. I'd just sit in the field. When we moved to London, I didn't even know that there were any fields to even sit in. That's where I met Jess. She had a Staffordshire Terrier. Usually by the time I got home, the shouting would have stopped. The door to their bedroom would be closed, and my mum would be in the kitchen cooking or just looking out the window. I always asked if she wanted to come and walk with me, that we should go together, but she always said no and that she had things to do. One day I got back from school. It was Wednesday because I had my PE bag, and there was crashing and shouting and crying. I got my dog lead and a new ball I'd gotten her for a birthday, and I was trying to get her lead on, and while they were arguing in the next room, but she was upset, my dog, and wouldn't sit still, so I couldn't get her lead on. I was in the kitchen and the back door was open, ready to go, and just before I could get out of the house, my stepdad came out of the living room and kicked her, my dog, twice. Just kicks her because she's barking and upset by the noise. I could hear Mum crying in the front room, and they said I hit him with the kettle 48 times. I don't really remember. My dog's called Molly. My mum always forgets to feed her.
Oh, that's also another moment where it's very hard to watch and listen to, isn't it? It's beautifully done, though, because you learn so much from that in a very understated way about how unhappy he is, how isolated, you said earlier, he feels, that they moved from somewhere that he's not comfortable, but that is obviously his dad's not around, that his stepdad is probably abusing his mother, that he wants to help her, but she won't let him help her. She can't let him help her because that would be siding against her partner, I guess. And the dog is everything to him. And then when he kicks the dog, he just loses it. And you sort of don't blame him, almost, really. But, we obviously discover that he's in for a very serious crime now. And as you said earlier, then, George, he's, that has an impact on how you feel about him because of his prospect. And it's alluded to as the play goes on, is about what that future will be for him. The reason they're doing the parenting classes, though, interestingly, is that he is going to be a father. So I guess Jess, the girl you referred to in the speech, Sam, he's met his girlfriend, is pregnant with his baby. But then even more sadly, of course, then he's been cut off from her. They won't let him speak to her from the prison on telephone. Her parents, one would think understandably, do not want her to have any contact with him. So he's completely cut off in that way. We discover as well that his mother isn't visiting. I guess how would she process what he's done? And he had a little sister who is living with his grandparents, and she's quite a bit younger, I think, the little sister. So he's actually already had he says at some point, some experience of looking after a young child, which is also sort of revealing that he was playing such a role in looking after his young sister. So there's a lot of background in there that's pretty tough for John Joe, and no wonder he seems traumatized. Certainly in the first two scenes or most of the play, when we see him and he's not talking much and he's not interacting, he is traumatized by where he is and I guess what he did. So yeah, fantastic character, so different from Cain. So as you said at the beginning, George, there's two amazingly wonderful different characters. And then we have Riyadh, who's a very powerful character. Even Cain is wary of him. So how would you describe Riyadh, George?
He's certainly the boss of the room. He's the highest status character in the room. He's the strongest person, which is a lovely reveal that happens in that first scene where you believe that Cain is this alpha male until Riyadh walks into the room, and it very, very quickly switches. But there's also, so you get this feeling from him that he is dangerous, but he's also very caring towards John Joe as the play goes on. He almost takes on a sort of big brother role for John Joe in as best a way as he can, I suppose, in that type of place. And he's also an intelligent lad. There's hope for him because he's studying. He's doing very well in his study, and because of that, when you look at the three of them, John Joe's going to be in for a very long time. Kane, it feels like very much a lost cause. And so it falls on Riyadh that we as an audience put all our hope in that he is the one that is going to change his ways and leave this place and thrive. And that certainly leans that way to make us believe that and make us want that for him.
Yes, he comes across as capable and strong. He's a figure to be reckoned with in the institution. And as you said, Kane even exceeds to him immediately. But he's also got this aptitude for numbers, as he says, and is doing a GCSE in maths and actually seems to be doing well at it. And there's a real prospect that he might be able to carry on with this. But, they're also, it's nuanced, isn't it? It's complex. I mean, why is he here? He's an aggressive character. He has a temper.
Yeah.
I guess, as you mentioned earlier, Sam, is he part of a gang? Is that where he's come from?
Yeah. I think he's... interestingly, obviously you talk about John Joe being traumatized, but I think for me, in many ways, Riyadh, probably some of the things that he's seen and done in the lead up to getting into the Young Offenders Institute are incredibly traumatizing and have really scarred him, and that's why he makes some of the decisions that he makes that lead him to where the play ends up, without too many spoilers.
Well, there's a real sense that as part of the plot is that there are other gang members in the prison, and there's a conflict and a potential danger going on outside the room. He talks about where his past, he was on the road. And does that mean that he was like The Wire, is out there doing the drug dealing?
That's it. Yeah, you got it. You know the lingo. You got the lingo.
Yes, I learn it all from television and plays.
Yeah, the road is just like the sort of collective word for living that life, basically, the gang life, dealing drugs, doing whatever.
Yeah. And he says he did this because his mom was never there and they had no money, and he thought this is what he had to. This is the only way to survive, I guess. His dad, we learned, was in prison when he was a young boy. And his girlfriend, we talk about the parenting. He has a son. He has a son, Marcus. Although his girlfriend seems to have stopped communicating with him, has found someone else. But he still has hopes and a determination. He says he wants to be a good father, and he's going to make it work, and he's going to earn a living and support his child. So that's why, as you say, George, I guess we have this hope. We have, he looks like he's capable of doing it. We see all these positive things, but we also know that his past is hard to escape, even in the present, because of what's going on in the prison around him. And we'll come to how it transpires and what the prospects really are and why. Let's just finish the characters, I guess, first, which was because there's a fourth character, Grace, who is completely different. She is an emissary of sorts from the outside world, isn't she? She's a grown-up, she's female, she's a proper parent, so to speak.
Yeah.
She feels like a different species almost, doesn't she, George?
Yeah, she does. And she's the teacher coming into the class. And it's such a difficult role to have to write, and also a really difficult role to play, because we have to have a feeling from her that she has control of that room and that she allows them to go off and be themselves at the same time, but that always there's enough respect there. And she does it in this sort of balance of being an authority figure in terms of being the teacher, but also in some ways feeling almost like a mother to them in lots of ways.
Yes.
She is a compassionate character. It feels like it's not the first time she's been in this type of room. I think she's a lovely character. The way that she talks to them and the way that she tries to help them grow as individuals, I think is a really beautiful thing. She represents kind of us as the audience, I suppose, and perhaps the mistake that she feels that she's made at the end is the same sort of mistake that we as an audience would make, of feeling that perhaps these boys' problems can be easily fixed if only this happens or this happened. And I think the lesson that she learns in the play is also very much the lesson that we as an audience learn.
Yes. I think what's also good about it is that she's not a saint. She's an ordinary person.
Exactly.
And I think that's brought out because you set it up, Sam, don't you, that there's a comparison inevitably between her parenting her son. She has a son, Alex, who's a teenager, I think, and how these boys have been parented or will parent. She's a more conventional model, clearly. But even then, she suggests she's not perfect, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think she's. I think she's a fairly humble person. I think she's probably a pretty good mum, all things considered. But I mean, it was always a sort of a back and forth in my head of whether to give a backstory that would really give her a real reason for her to be there. Like being from an abusive relationship and therefore wanting to help other boys break that cycle or whatever. But actually that always just felt a little bit trite, or just felt like it detracted from the stories of the young men. I think Grace is sometimes a little bit of an enigma, but that's by virtue of the role that she plays in that room. Exposition from Grace is difficult because what she chooses to share with those boys is nominally could be used against her. So I think she is quite guarded as a person because of the role that she's taking over these young men. So maybe we don't learn as much about her as we could, but I think that's probably feels like a true representation of what a teacher in that role would be like.
I think that's absolutely right. She can't afford to be that open. And in fact, she takes some risks occasionally, just emotionally, even, I think, in the way she supports them. But I think the whole point of her as a model as well is she's not a perfect mom. And I think that plays into what I think is one of the central themes of the play, is about parenting and how we are as parents, what the impact we have on our children is as parents, and how it's lasting, of course. And yet, what do we know? Can it be taught? This is a class in parenting.
Yeah.
And she says at one stage that what you just said, George, about represents all of us as well, saying you can't watch them every second of every day. They bump their heads and graze their knees and come to you to make it better. And that's what you have to do. That's it. And actually, what's interesting, of course, and I think which is the nub of what happens to these boys, is that whoever isn't there for them in that way, right? They have no role models, positive role models in any way, really, from their own experience of what it means to be a father. And I wonder if that's obviously was part of what you were doing here, Sam, and very central to what you're doing. Conscious of that is what you wanted to say, that this is the theme, that you're thinking about that, and why were you thinking about that?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head, really, with that. I mean, it's hopefully an indictment of the justice system and the way that it works. But yeah, at its heart, it's about the sort of cyclical nature of these young men's lives, really, and the impact that their childhood's had on them, and how that will impact their children and carry on and inexorably for forever. If that cycle's not broken, if someone doesn't come along to them and tell them that it's not their fault, really.
Yeah.
That what has happened to them and the way that they are and the choices that they make is not, when they graze their knees and bump their heads, they didn't have anyone to come and tell them that everything would be all right. But that doesn't make them inherently bad people.
No, I mean, the fact is they don't have these role models. Kane talks about no one taught him how to ride a bike. He had to learn on his own, and he thought it'd be a DOS, and of course...
And that becomes an armour. That becomes an armour for them to wear, doesn't it? This sort of sense of pride almost, that you develop these ways, these mechanisms of coping as a child in order to cope with the absence of a parent or the violence of a parent or whatever. And then when you become an adult, those coping mechanisms aren't useful anymore because you don't need them. And really, you should shed them, but they're so wrapped up in your sense of identity and who you are that it becomes almost impossible. I mean, we've all got them from our parents in less extreme ways probably than Kane and Riyadh, but from the lessons we learnt from our parents, we develop coping mechanisms that get in the way of our adult lives. But for these young men, it's a very extreme form of that, I suppose.
But there'd be so many more positive. If you've got a constructive parental relationship, there's so many more positive ways to... You're shown how to do this, and they just don't have that. And yet, what's heartbreaking as well is that as they face being parents themselves, they have an instinct, don't they, about wanting to be good parents and what it needs to be. They have the instinct to love and to look after.
And to be loved as well, I think that's, they recognise that that's what they want. even if they would never admit it in a million years in that environment. What John Joe wants at the end of the play is to be loved. What Cain wants is these things, and they want to try and give that to their children if they possibly can, but know that the circumstances are against them.
Yeah, there's a a lovely scene where they actually rehearse a little bit about what they've learned from the parenting class from Grace, and they're all up for it. They all sound like yeah, and then you got to bathe them, and then you got to change them, and you're going, yeah, you're getting it, guys. But I mean, the heartbreaking thing is, will they have an opportunity to do that, and can they break this cycle? So you're interesting. You're saying, Sam. I don't know whether you thought about this, George, as well. Is it a political play? Is it about what society is doing with these boys and the prison system itself, for example?
Yeah, I think 100% it is a political play, and I think it is about what society is doing with these boys in terms of what's happening in these young offenders institution, and is that the best way to solve the problems with any of those three boys? Is it going to stop somebody like Cain from reoffending? I don't believe it is. When it's a case of somebody like John Joe and it's his first crime, I totally appreciate the degree of his crime, but is that the way to solve it, or is that going to create a bigger mess in future? The same with Riyadh's issues and what he's been involved in. And I think it also, for me, goes beyond the Young Offenders Institution. A Young Offenders Institution is an extreme example of these boys, but there's also boys like this that fall through the cracks in schools because they're easily dismissed and beyond. I think the problems go way, 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 way before we get to the Young Offenders Institution. So yeah, it's hugely a political play, and I think what it does so brilliantly is that it makes you care about people that normally an audience member might cross the road to avoid. And if it does that and it makes you actually think about these characters and people like them, then I think that's a wonderful thing, and that's what plays should be doing.
Yes, because it's not just, as you say, about the institution, although I'd like to say a bit more about that as well, but it's more generally about social prejudice too, isn't it? Because of the way that we react, sitting in the privileged position I am or outside, to these people, whether they're in prison or not. And so it's partly about the expectations that we have, the social prejudice, and how we pigeonhole people, the assumptions we make on class or how they speak or level of education or social circumstances or whatever. We can write people off pretty easily. And actually, I think what's fascinating about the way the play works is the way that affects the way they feel about themselves as well. It affects their confidence. Cain says, we're not going to be any good at being fathers. But most heartbreakingly, in particular, Riyadh, at one point, Grace shows him a prospectus for a college, and he's doing well in his math GCSE, and if he does this, he could go on. But, then there's this hesitancy in Riyadh where he thinks, I don't belong there. They won't welcome me there. He's assumed this kind of view of himself that society has imposed upon him, and that's heartbreaking, isn't it?
I was just going to say, I think so much that comes into that as well as an unwillingness to allow yourself to be vulnerable ever. And I think that comes from backgrounds like that, where the same as we were saying about Cain, part of why Cain perhaps doesn't want to do the restorative justice is because if he puts himself in a room where he has to face up to the person that he committed the crime with, he has to be vulnerable. And if Riyadh goes into that college, he has to be vulnerable, like he is the fish out of water. And there's so much in that. When you come from certain backgrounds, it's that fear of ever looking like an idiot and looking like you don't know what you're doing.
Because they're used to vulnerability being targeted, and then if you show vulnerability in the environments and the worlds that they're from, then it can be exploited very, very quickly.
Exactly, yeah.
So they've just this learned behaviour of basically never stepping outside of that role of big strong man, basically.
Yeah. It's the macho models there that to belong, this is the way you have to behave.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting you talk about the cycle, breaking that cycle. I've waited this long to ask you, actually, Sam, about the title of the play. What does the title of the play mean? Where does it come from?
Shook basically means scared. It's a London phrase, but scared, basically. And Riyadh says it towards the end of the play about Cain. Well, when I named it Shook, a lot of people thought that John Joe's crime before it got revealed was that he'd like shaken a baby to death or something. There's something about shook and shaking and like that seems to speak to people about cradling a baby. But yeah, shook just basically means scared, and I think that's what all these young boys are really. You know, they're all scared, even if John Joe's probably the only one who's able to show it.
But in the context of the breaking of the cycle, Riyadh uses the word, doesn't he, about Cain, because he basically says Cain, as you said earlier, I think, George, Cain is textbook, that there's every possibility he's just going to end up back in here, even if he gets out now. And he says, breeders like that, it's like they're programmed. When it gets hard, they get shook and come back to what they know, isn't it? In moments of crisis, you're saying they don't have the tools to behave other than the way they've grown up and the way they've learned in some dysfunctional way to behave. And that shook is those moments where everything's unsettled, is shaken up, and it's a mix of fear and rage and uncertainty, lack of confidence, whatever. Yeah. And you just fall back on something deeply ingrained. And I guess the suggestion was that these things are so deeply ingrained that, you know, these aren't easily changed just by what you do sort of on the outside of life, because they're internalized. Isn't there some suggestion that that's what Grace had this, you said earlier, didn't you, that Grace had this idea we might be able to fix this, but then Cain throws it back at her. I think it's Cain, isn't it, towards the end, Sam, and says, yeah, this is internalized. You don't understand. It's up in our heads. It's not just the outside world. Is that right?
Absolutely. I think he finds that a completely naive position to take, really, in terms of that some 6-week course and, you know, a few nice words are going to change years and years of rejection and poverty. And after this course is finished, or that after they come out of this, then what do? Cain, for all of his lies and exaggerations and everything, I think in some respects is a realist in terms of the way that he's grown up and what he sees his future to be. I think Grace manages to infuse him with, Grace or Riyadh probably to a certain extent as well, managed to infuse him with a bit of idealism, and eventually he takes an opportunity for the first time in his life and makes a choice and step in the right direction. But whether, you know, you can only hope maybe at the end of the play that step will lead on to another step, and it's another step and another step, and that will have a more holistic effect on his life, and a good one. But, you know, if you're a more pessimistic person, you might think that step, maybe he'll assault that man again, or maybe because that person will call him out on his behaviour or whatever. So I think in some ways, I suppose Cain feels it's naive for Grace to think that something like this could change generations of trauma, really.
Yeah, and who he is, change who he is.
Yeah,
because who he is formed from a very early age, as it is for all of us.
Yeah,
and it's so much harder for them to change than it is to do the same thing again as well, isn't it? You know, like if once Cain leaves here, it's so much harder for him to try and spend the rest of his life not committing any crime or not hitting anybody or not doing anything than doing it. And that's why those cycles are near impossible to break, because it's so difficult when everything in you tells you to react a certain way to somebody confronting you or somebody rejecting you or somebody doing any of these things. Your natural thing is to do what you've always done.
Yeah. You talked earlier about the institutions and the systems, and this is a political play in the sense that I suppose that we all know that 50% or whatever it is of offenders will reoffend. So these systems don't really work either. And yet we continue with them. I would hope that seeing plays like this will help increase our awareness of the challenges of people from different circumstances, any kind of circumstances, but also the purpose and consequences of prison as a method of dealing with crime. I had a moment yesterday, actually, I was thinking about this, when I was out doing the usual walk that we do during lockdown to escape the confinement of our house. And I thought to myself, how horrific a punishment is it to lock people up where they cannot even go out for a walk? And how easily this would send you crazy, because we're all going crazy now in this lockdown scenario. And the prison is that multiplied 100-fold, isn't it?
Yeah.
It seems inhumane.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, at the moment, isn't it? They're all on lockdown 23 hours a day because of COVID restrictions and stuff like that, and have been for nearly a year. So, I mean, it's just the conditions in prisons, while they were bad, are horrific at the moment.
I think it was you that said about it, Sam, when we were in rehearsals, that the idea that you are rehabilitated in any way whilst in there is complete fantasy because of the fact that essentially you're focused on day-to-day survival. So it's not as though going in there gives you any time to reflect on what you've done and what you want to do going forward. It's about surviving.
That's it.
Your time in there. So
how can you be introspective when you have constant external threats to your person and your safety? It makes things almost impossible. I mean, these sort of rehabilitative courses are far too few and far between as well. They trialled a course like this up in a northern adult prison, and they did it for, I think it was about 12 weeks. And the reward was, if you completed the course, you got to spend more time with your children. They'd be able to come in and you'd be able to have more sessions with them and help them with their homework and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And the reoffending rates of the people that took part in that course dropped by about 70%. Because, I mean, it's not surprising, is it? Is if you reconnect these men with their families, they're not going to want to do 2 or 3 year stretches away from them. But it was discontinued, I think, in 2010 when the new Tory government came in at that time, because you enter then into a conversation with voters about punishment or rehabilitation. What should prison be? Should it be a place in which prisoners are given the opportunity to reflect on their crimes and learn and come out as better members of society? Or should it be a place in which all of their rights are taken away from them and the transgressions that they've committed, they're continually punished for those things? And sadly, lots of people seemingly still think that it should be the punishment.
But I mean, the thing that's so ridiculous about that is pragmatically, it doesn't work.
Yeah,
it's not protecting our society. It's just perpetuating the problem.
It's incredibly expensive as well.
Yeah. Anyway, we could go on at some time about this. And I think no, don't apologize, because that's partly what this is about, isn't it, Sam? But what I wondered is, where do you think people, when they leave the theatre, is there hope at all at the end of Shook? We've been sounding pretty negative here about the system and their prospects and how breaking the cycle is so difficult.
Yeah.
What do you reckon, guys? What do we take away as...
I certainly think there is hope in there. You know, in terms of that, there's hope in that Kane might take this opportunity. But I suppose what I'd hope is that people leave not necessarily hopeful about the characters, but thinking about how they can try and have some effect on this situation and what they can do to make people like these characters not have to go through these things and not be stuck in these places. So that would be the hope that I think people would feel positive at the end of it and more empathetic towards people like these characters.
Spot on. Sam?
Yeah, I can only echo that, really. I mean, I suppose the journey of the play for the boys is one of them becoming more empathetic. So it's a journey from at the start of the play where they're casually homophobic, they're misogynistic, they're only thinking nominally about themselves to a certain extent, in that learning to become a parent is empathy.
Yes.
And I think hopefully if the audience can take on a bit of that journey and take on, as George says, a new understanding or a new perspective on who these young men are, and if they're ever to interact with them, or if they ever do get a chance to interact with them or have some impact on young men like that, then they will do it positively. Fingers crossed.
I think that's exactly right. It's interesting, though, that I would say about the play and the experience of the play is that the points that we've all been discussing are made extremely lightly, so to speak, from the hand of the playwright, Sam, that we basically feel all this because we feel and care for these characters, and we feel real emotion for these characters. They come to care about each other, as you just said, and we certainly care about them. So I think it has an impact on us in an emotional sense in the way art should, and also makes us think. And I have to say, what's so energizing for me is, I think you said it, George, at the beginning, possibly, that it exposes me to a world and to characters that I don't meet every day, obviously. I mean, we all live in our bubbles, literally at the moment, of course, but we basically socially live in our bubbles, don't we? And, you know, we're living with and listening to our own tribe, and the assumptions and prejudice are based on that, where we come from and the bubble we live in. And this gives us at least some awareness of something outside that bubble to empathize with, perhaps understand more, and most importantly, possibly even just to respect people who come from different backgrounds and circumstances. So, and it's interesting you're saying about parenting requiring empathy, because ultimately that's what the play is about, I guess, is empathy, as you've so eloquently said, both of you. I think we've run over time, but thank you so much, guys. I absolutely love this play and love talking to you about it. Before we bring our curtain down, I forewarned you that one of the traditions of our podcast is that I like to ask my guests to recommend a play that we could talk about in a future episode. So, do each of you have a personal favorite that you'd be happy to nominate?
The play that I'm going to nominate is a play called The Mikvah Project by Josh Azuz, which was a revival, was staged at the Orange Tree Theatre just before. It was the last play I saw actually before coronavirus closed all of our theatres. It was a revival directed by George Green. I thought the play was great, and I'm pretty sure they've done a radio version of it that I'm sure you can probably find on like BBC Sounds or something. It's a brilliant play about a Jewish ritual of submerging in water. These two Jewish men meet from very different lives, and it's a brilliant, brilliant play, and Georgia did a great job with the revival of it. That's my pick.
Excellent, Sam. Thank you. I will search out the radio version, and perhaps it'll come back to the Orange Tree, and that's local to me, so I would definitely go and see that on your recommendation.
Yeah, fingers crossed. You definitely should. It's a great play.
George, what's yours?
Mine would be Faith, Hope and Charity, which is by Alexander Zeldin and was on at the National in 2019, that I went to see a couple of weeks just before we started rehearsals for Shook, and I felt incredibly inspired by, and I took a lot of what was happening in that production into rehearsals for Shook. And it's about a sort of community food project that is cooking lunches for the community and for people that can't afford to feed themselves. And it's a big piece, and we meet all these different characters in this particular community, and it was an amazing piece of theatre. It was, I thought about it perhaps more than any production that I've ever seen. That would be my choice.
Fantastic. It sounds pretty topical for these times of social inequality.
Exactly. It very much was.
Great pick.
Thank you for these two great suggestions. Thank you so much, Sam and George, for joining us today. Just before we go, I'd like to remind you that if you're listening to this during March 2021, you can watch Papatango's production of Shook online up until the 28th of March. Simply go to the Papatango website to book, or if you hear this after that, don't miss any opportunity to see or read this play. Thank you both for bringing us Shook. It's been one of the highlights of my lockdown, I have to say.
Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you.
As the curtain falls on the confines of the detention center and the challenging lives of Kane, John Joe, and Riyadh, I feel the exhilarating emotion that successful art compels. The American writer George Sanders describes the changes that occur in our state of mind after reading fiction, or I would add of seeing great plays, as follows. I am reminded that my mind is not the only mind. I feel an increased confidence in my ability to imagine the experiences of other people and accept these as valid. I feel I exist on a continuum with other people. I find myself liking the world more. I feel luckier to be here. I feel more aware of the things of the world and more interested in them. I assure you that you will feel some or all of these things after you witness Shook. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.